Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future, and this segment certainly no exception. We are going to be talking with about a very, very interesting time in American history. Lyndon Johnson, the Congress at the time, and the battle for the Great Society. It is the topic of a new work called The Fierce Urgency of Now. Julian E. Zelizer, he is a professor at Princeton University, is also a prolific author as well, and should be an interesting conversation indeed. Julian, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Good. Lyndon Johnson is someone that I think a lot of people, well, baby boomers anyway, would think they know, but I wonder in many ways, did we really know what he was really all about? How well did we know Lyndon Johnson?
Well, you know, in some ways he developed this mythic character. You know, for many decades after the 1960s, all that anyone knew about him was being the president who got us into Vietnam, and he was one of the most hated and detested figures. And I think we had a caricature of him as a warmonger who plunged the nation deeper and deeper into the conflict. And now we have a new image of him in the last few years as the ultimate political magician, the politician, the president who is able to get things done in Congress in a way that no one else could. So I think in both cases, both when he was hated and when he was loved, we have certain misconceptions about him and in some ways a thin understanding of who this president actually was.
One of the things that always seems, I've always gotten the impression, he had sort of a love-hate, maybe a little more hate, with President Kennedy, not only as a senator but also as president. And I'm wondering the delicate balance he had to do after he took over office in '63. How does he not sort of throw Kennedy under the bus and yet at the same time do some things a little bit differently?
Well, you know, politically it wouldn't have been in his interest. So most importantly, you know, he, like all Americans, you know, was living through this tragedy and was not going to throw a president under the bus who had been assassinated. He wasn't going to simply move forward and try to ignore him. A lot of the issues Kennedy finally was working on in his final year as president were also issues that mattered to him. And so the continuity in terms of civil rights, in terms of Medicare, made sense to him in terms of what he wanted to do. And finally, there was a political logic to it. So the president understood that if he connected himself to the deceased president, it would strengthen him politically. So even if personally he didn't think he was a very effective politician and he had, you know, bad feelings about Kennedy's crowd who he thought didn't like him because he wasn't a Harvard-educated politician,
right.
I think he understood that he had to maintain the connection.
What about, fair or unfair, the notion that when, as a result of the assassination, that Johnson was able to come in and get a lot of these things executed and through Congress because not only he was sympathetic, but that he really had a blank check? The fact was, underlying all this, there was some resistance, was there not?
Oh, there was amazing resistance. I think that argument is overused, and that's one of the things I argue in the book. There was public sympathy toward the memory of Kennedy, but that didn't translate into legislation getting through. So in terms of the big bill that gets through the year after, it's the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And to understand how civil rights activists got through the Senate filibuster by Southerners, it wasn't so much the memory of Kennedy as it was the incredible mobilization and organization at the grassroots and in Washington by the movement. And it was quite a fight after Kennedy's death to make sure that bill didn't, just fall apart in Congress. And a lot of the rest of the agenda doesn't go through until after the '64 election. So Kennedy, his big issue was Medicare. Johnson pushes for Medicare after Kennedy's death, but members of Congress, despite all the sympathy, are not willing to move forward with it, and the bill is stifled until '65. So I think while the sympathy existed, sometimes we overstate how much of a window that offered Lyndon Johnson.
Lyndon Johnson brings a sort of Texas Southern backslap and good old boy wink and a nod sort of style to the office, juxtaposed, as you said earlier, to Kennedy's a little bit smoother, more maybe sort of politically, sort of out of a book style. And I'm curious as to how that, obviously it served him well in some cases, but can you give us some examples of alliances or the kinds of agreements maybe behind the scenes he had to do to get some of this stuff through?
Sure. As one of the things, the biggest deal he makes is a deal for Vietnam. So, we often think that Vietnam eventually overwhelms the Great Society, but in fact, very early, Johnson is trying to win over Southern hawks and Republicans by saying he's going to be a hawkish Democrat, and that would allow him to pass his liberal agenda. So the biggest deal of all is to remain hawkish on a war that he privately was hearing a lot of doubts about from all sides of the political spectrum, in order to keep the conservatives in Congress at bay as he tries to move forward with Medicare and voting rights and other issues like that. And then he, as his presidency progresses, one of the biggest deals he makes is in 1967 and 68, where he agrees to budget cuts that are being called for by people like Wilbur Mills, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, so that he can get the money he needs for Vietnam. And a lot of the spending comes to a halt, or it slows down, and that's pretty devastating to the growth of his programs.
What did you? And again, you're pretty astute politically. You've written about this quite a bit. What was a big surprise to you early on as you were doing research in this? What smacked you in the face is, wow, had no clue that was going on?
Well, one of the things I learned early on from listening to the Lyndon Johnson tapes were how many doubts existed about Vietnam in his inner circle of policymaking. We have this image, and I had it, that there was a blind adherence to the Cold War ideology of the period. Everyone thought we had to fight communism, and everyone assumed that winning in Vietnam was essential to that battle, and we were almost blinded by that. But when you listen to the tapes, it's not true. You could hear people like Richard Russell, the Southern hawk from Georgia, telling Lyndon Johnson this is a war that's not winnable, and it's a war that's not necessary. You can hear Lyndon Johnson saying that back to skeptics. You can even hear doubts with people like Robert McNamara. So when you hear that a lot, which I did, it's pretty sobering and it's pretty overwhelming to see that this was not a war that we inevitably had to get through. The second surprise was Lyndon Johnson understanding how limited his power was. The image we all have of Lyndon Johnson, and I had this, was he was the ultimate presidential bully. He was the person who believed that you could use power to achieve almost anything when you were president. But that's not the Lyndon Johnson you hear or read about in the White House material. You hear a president who understood just how powerful Congress was, and that the ability of presidents to do a lot was really limited, and that's part of why he moved so quickly. So both of those things really surprised me.
Again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. We're talking to Julian E. Zelizer. He is the professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, also a fellow at New America. He is the auditor. Well, you're auditor, I guess. You're the author and editor of numerous books on the American political scene, the most recent of which, The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society. Julian, what about Lyndon Johnson? Not only had to work with the legacy of Kennedy. Robert Kennedy is still around. Ed Kennedy is still around. Kennedyites are still there. Lots of political maneuvering, though, that he still had to do, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Certainly, Robert Kennedy is an ongoing source of tension. At first, he's still the Attorney General, and then he will be a senator in New York. And in Johnson's mind, he's always a potential threat. Johnson, until he decides to resign, is thinking of running in 1968. He believes Robert Kennedy's the person who's going to try to best him. So he doesn't like Kennedy. He's always trying to keep him at bay. And this is a really fraught relationship because on many domestic issues, the two are on the same page until 1967 and 68 when Kennedy moves to the left. And there's also tension with Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy is a very young senator at that time. Not a lot of people know much about him, but one of the stories I talk about is that when the voting rights legislation in 65 reaches the Senate, Ted Kennedy causes all kinds of problems because he wants it to be even more liberal. He wants a prohibition on poll taxes. And this is more than Johnson thinks is going to make it into the bill. And they get in this big fight where he believes Kennedy's causing all kinds of problems unnecessarily, in some ways to humiliate him, but also to take a principled stand that wouldn't work politically. So throughout his presidency, the tension with the Kennedys never goes away.
You're talking later in his political career, obviously, but Lyndon Johnson is dealing with, so to speak, everyone, as we just said, the Kennedys, Martin Luther King. He's dealing with Strom Thurmond. He's dealing with George Wallace and all kinds of characters. The complete political spectrum to the greatest extremes probably in modern history, was he not?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we think today that a president is dealing with all sorts of extremes, but I think we forget just how contentious the 1960s were. So he's dealing with very liberal Democrats who are calling for programs that today would be almost unthinkable. Even something like Medicare was pretty bold at the time. The idea that government was going to insure all elderly people to make sure they had hospital insurance. Or civil rights was not just an esoteric issue. This was an issue being fought on and fought bitterly in the streets with violence and images that Americans couldn't believe. And he was dealing with people who supported segregation, like George Wallace, and were willing to fight the government on it. He was dealing with very liberal Democrats who were saying that we needed radical change in America. And he was also dealing with just very powerful, skilled legislators like Senator Everett Dirksen, the Senate Minority Leader, who really understood how to check a president. And so this is the political world. It was both contentious, difficult, and very slow as it is today.
And certainly I would think dealing with, whether it's Kennedy or some of the other ones, dealing with and beginning to see a changing of the guard in terms of younger people coming in, new ideas. My gosh, all the anti-war people that he was, that was definitely a political factor at the time. At a time, as you were saying, America, so to speak, was shedding some skin and moving into a newer age. It must have been quite an adjustment for him.
It was, and it wasn't simply the students. Within Congress, you had younger members who had come into office in the 1950s and in the 1964 election, who were connected to all the movements you're discussing, and who were very insistent on domestic policy, that there was no more time to compromise. And this is the same message that people like Martin Luther King were saying. And this was hard for a president. You know, how should he position himself with this liberal pressure that was demanding quick change and instant change? And for a while, he actually allies himself with the movement, and he moves forward on some pretty big bills.
If you were, in your opinion, Julian, if Lyndon Johnson was given a blank slate and allowed to wave a wand, what kind of legislation would he want to see passed? Where did he fall truly on the political spectrum? Take him out of that embattled situation that he had in the mid to late 60s and put him in a sort of a more passive time politically. What would we have maybe thought differently about him?
Well, I think the thing he never dealt with, but something he cared very much about, was the fragility and deterioration of the inner city. And, the riots in Detroit and Newark take place in 1967, and they frustrate him because he feels like the rioters don't appreciate everything he was trying to do. But they also frustrate him because he's very aware that the government hasn't dealt with the problems that were afflicting the inner cities. Problems like high unemployment rates and unfair housing and inadequate housing and more. And Johnson very much wants to tackle this. I think in many ways he believes that until he really deals and resolves the problem of poverty and urban decay, his presidency wouldn't be fulfilled. But he never really gets to do it. He starts starts with the war on poverty, but ultimately the spending in Vietnam and the conservative backlash by 67 and 68 check his ability to deal with that very important part of what the Great Society was about.
Beyond Vietnam, there is not much talk, or not as much as with most, of any work that he did in terms of foreign policy. Help us understand maybe where he might fall on that spectrum, and remind us again of some of the foreign policy victories and maybe defeats or others from your perspective.
Well, he was very successful in terms of most of the Cold War. Most accounts that we have of his presidency, including mine, stress that outside of Vietnam, he does very well in terms of strengthening U.S. relations with NATO, overall achieving stability when violence and war breaks out in the Middle East involving Israel and Middle Eastern states. He provides a lot of support to Israel and is able to reestablish stability for a while in the region. And overall with the Soviet Union, even though you have this raging war going on in Vietnam, it isn't a period of great turbulence. So most scorecards say he's a pretty decent foreign policy leader, but he has this one huge catastrophic mistake.
What about one of the things we have not talked about is the Economic Improvement Act. I think I've got that name right, and that I think he considered very much a brand of him and a measure of him. Is that a fair statement? And tell us about that.
Yeah, I think you mean the Economic Opportunity Act.
The Economic Opportunity, right? Yeah,
that was a program launched in '64. Initially, it's a very small program, and it's pretty cheap. It's not funded very generously. But the whole idea is, in an era when the economy was growing, America could tackle the problem of permanent poverty in this nation. And the money goes for various things, including a job program, but more famously, it provides money to local efforts, local ideas, local initiatives to combat poverty. And it will also include food stamps, it will include the Head Start program, the Economic Opportunity program, and these other components all came together to be the war on poverty. And Johnson believed very much that this could help to define him, and that's why he's very eager in '64 to launch it. It becomes a very controversial part of his legacy. One of the biggest problems that happens is a lot of the federal money goes to local activists in cities like Chicago who use it to set up programs to fight poverty, but they don't do it in alliance with the urban Democratic machine politicians. And so by 1965 and 66, you have tension between Democrats like Mayor Daley of Chicago and the war on poverty, because Daley says this money's going around me, not through me. But it really was an ambitious program. It was an idea that today seems very hard to conceive of, that the government would commit millions of dollars of resources to try to eradicate poverty in the ideal, but certainly to provide more of a base of support for poor Americans to become self-sufficient and to become part of the marketplace.
What about, and again, you touched on this briefly, but let's talk about his relationship as well with those in the civil rights movement at the time. Again, if you lived through that era, you knew how intense that was, and the various forces aligning. Talk about his relationship with Martin Luther King and others in the civil rights movement.
Well, there was certainly a lot of tension. Johnson's biggest fear was always that the demands of civil rights activists would go beyond what he could respond to, given the realities of Congress. So he's always worried that civil rights activists were going to ask for too much or were going to do too much, and the result would not be civil rights legislation, but it would be problems and gridlock in Congress. But even with those fears, in 1964, in 1965, and as late as 66, I think Johnson still saw people like Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders as allies. He worked with them. He understood that the grassroots pressure that they were able to build in places like Selma in 1965 would help him get legislation through Congress. He understood that a president can't act on his own. So there's conversations with King in January of 65 about voting rights, where Johnson says, I am in favor of voting rights, but I'm not sure I'm going to get it through Congress. I need help. And King sees Johnson as an ally, and his response is to go join the protest in Selma and get national attention for the marches for voting rights and create a climate in Congress where saying no to voting rights becomes impossible. So in the middle of the 60s, it's very much an alliance, even though there's tension. It's a partnership, and it's pretty remarkable to see. By 1967 and 68, it's more a relationship full of tension. And I think especially once Martin Luther King comes out against the Vietnam War, Johnson doesn't see the movement as his ally anymore and starts to see it as a problem.
Well, as we start to wind down here, let's step away from it and look at it from a broader perspective. In this year, baby boomers that were going to school, grade school, and riding tricycles at the time are now driving their cars around, going to their work and preparing for retirement, if not already. What remains, Medicare, Medicaid, Civil Rights Act, a lot of economic activity. Vietnam has come and gone. What, as you step away, Julian, what is the lesson out of here? And tell us, the Great Society, what remains and how much did it, in fact, impact the last 50 years?
Well, in terms of the latter part of the question, it had a huge impact. One of the things I cover in the book is that even though we have been through many decades of conservative politics since the 1960s, what historians call the age of Ronald Reagan, most of the Great Society remains intact. And most of the programs that passed in this period, even though some have been controversial, are very essential and basic parts of American society today. From the Civil Rights Act to Medicare and Medicaid to funding for the arts to education programs and much more. And I think that's pretty remarkable that even in a short period, Congress can pass legislation that, even if it's controversial, can last decades if it's well designed. The basic lesson of the book is not to rely too much on presidential power. The story of the Great Society is a story about how civil rights activists and organizations created a Congress that was willing to move on the legislation Lyndon Johnson sent them. And it's about an election in 1964 where voters changed Congress by voting for a Congress with huge liberal majorities after a long time when conservatives had ruled the roost. And ultimately, to change Washington, to change a Washington that seems dysfunctional, we learn from the 60s it has to happen from the bottom up, not the top down. And we can't simply expect presidents, even a Lyndon Johnson, to step into a contentious, dysfunctional system and on their own get these kinds of legislative breakthroughs.
Well, the work is The Fierce Urgency of Now, Lyndon Johnson, Congress, and the Battle for the Great Society by Julian E. Zelizer. He is a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton. He also is a weekly columnist for CNN.com. Julian, fascinating story indeed, and a good one for sure. How can we get a copy of the book and find out a little bit more about all the work that you do?
You can get the book on any independent bookstore, Amazon, Barnes & Nobles. All the online booksellers also have it in any major bookstore. So it's available everywhere. And then I also have a website, www.julianzelizer.com, where I have all my news articles and op-eds.
All right. Well, hey, listen, thank you so much for the time, and appreciate it, and best of luck with the book.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.